The last time America built an F-22 Raptor rolled off the Lockheed Martin production line in 2011. That jet, tail number 4195, was the 197th and final Raptor ever made. The line went cold, the tooling was broken down, the engineers moved on, and the United States Air Force was left with a fleet of 183 combat-coded aircraft that were supposed to define American air superiority for the next 50 years. That was the plan. That was the promise. And for a while, it seemed like it might actually hold. It is not holding. Today, the F-22 Raptor, the most advanced air superiority fighter ever built, is being retired at a pace and on a timeline that nobody in 2005 would have believed possible. Aircraft that have barely crossed the halfway point of their expected service life are being cut. Squadrons are being restructured. The Air Force is already talking openly about a next-generation replacement that most of the public has never heard of. And the decisions being made right now, quietly, in budget documents and classified briefings and congressional testimony, will determine whether the United States maintains air dominance for the next 3 decades or cedes it entirely. This is not a small story. This is not a procurement footnote. This is the most consequential shift in American air power since the F-15 Eagle entered service in 1976. And if you are not paying attention to it, you are missing something that matters enormously. Before we go any further, take a second to subscribe. Most people watching right now have not subscribed yet. It is free, it takes 2 seconds, and it means you will not miss the stories that the mainstream media is not covering. Now let us get into this. To understand why the F-22 is being retired decades ahead of schedule, you have to understand what the F-22 actually is, what it was built for, and why those two things are no longer the same. The F-22 Raptor entered operational service in December of 2005. It was, by every objective measure, a generational leap forward in fighter aircraft design. Nothing else on Earth came close. The jet was designed around a concept called first look, first shot, first kill. The idea was simple in principle and staggering in execution. The F-22 would find its enemy before its enemy found it, shoot before the enemy could shoot back, and destroy the target before the target ever knew it was in a fight. To achieve that, Lockheed Martin and Boeing, who partnered on the airframe, built the Raptor around 5 revolutionary capabilities working simultaneously. The first was stealth. Not the crude angular stealth of the early F-117 Nighthawk, but a refined, sophisticated, all-aspect, low-observable design that reduced the F-22's radar cross-section to roughly the size of a steel marble. From the front, one of the most advanced radar systems on Earth would struggle to detect it at combat ranges. This was not achieved through paint alone. It was built into the shaping of the aircraft, the alignment of every surface, the way the engine inlets were designed to hide the radar-reflective fan blades of the engines, the internal weapons bays that kept missiles tucked inside the fuselage rather than hanging on external pylons where they would light up an enemy radar like a Christmas tree. The second was supercruise. Most fighter jets can break the sound barrier, but only by lighting their afterburners, which burns enormous amounts of fuel and creates a massive heat signature. The F-22 can cruise at supersonic speeds, above Mach 1.5, without using afterburner at all. This gives it a fundamental tactical advantage. It can arrive at the fight faster, with more fuel remaining, and with less thermal exposure than any other fighter on the planet. The third was integrated avionics. The F-22's sensor suite was, at its introduction, unlike anything that had ever been integrated into a single aircraft. The AN/APG-77 active electronically scanned array radar could track dozens of targets simultaneously, identify threats, build a complete tactical picture, and do it all while emitting so little electromagnetic energy that enemy radar warning receivers struggled to detect that it was even operating. The pilot did not have to manage sensors manually. The aircraft fused everything together and presented a coherent picture. The cockpit did the cognitive work that previous generations of pilots had to do themselves, under pressure, at the edge of human performance. The fourth was maneuverability. The Raptor was equipped with 3-dimensional thrust vectoring nozzles on its twin Pratt & Whitney F119 engines. These nozzles could deflect exhaust up, down, and at angles, giving the aircraft an ability to point its nose, and therefore its weapons, in directions that the laws of aerodynamics would normally prohibit. In a close-range turning fight, the F-22 could execute maneuvers that legacy fighters simply could not counter. The Cobra maneuver, which involves pitching the nose nearly vertical while the aircraft continues moving forward, bled airspeed from a pursuer, and repositioned the Raptor for a shot. In exercises, F-22 pilots have achieved simulated kill ratios against legacy fourth-generation fighters of more than 100 to 1. That is not a typo, 100 simulated kills for every simulated loss. The fifth was electronic warfare. The F-22 carried passive electronic intelligence systems that could detect, classify, and geolocate enemy radar and communication emitters without ever broadcasting its own position. It could listen to the electromagnetic environment, build a picture of the threat landscape, and relay that information to other friendly forces without exposing itself. Put all 5 of those capabilities together, and you have an aircraft that was not just better than its competition, it existed in a completely different category. The gap between an F-22 and the best Russian or Chinese fighter jet of 2005 was not a gap, it was a chasm. So why is it being retired early? If the jet is that dominant, why would the United States Air Force start cutting F-22s from the inventory before their airframes have even worn out? The answer is complicated, and it is not comfortable, but it is real, and it comes down to 4 interlocking problems that have been building since before the ink dried on the F-22's operational acceptance papers. The first problem is the production cut that happened in 2009. The Air Force originally wanted 750 F-22s. That number was later revised down to 648, then to 438, then to 381, and finally, devastatingly, to 187 combat-coded aircraft, with the program terminated entirely under the 2009 defense budget overseen by then Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. The reasoning at the time had a certain internal logic. The United States was fighting counterinsurgency wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Those wars needed ground support aircraft, transport planes, ISR platforms, and drones. Nobody needed a 5th-generation air superiority fighter to chase Taliban fighters through mountain valleys. The F-22 had never been used in combat, and the argument was made, repeatedly and publicly, that it was a Cold War relic chasing Cold War threats that no longer existed at the scale that justified the expense. That argument turned out to be catastrophically wrong. Because while the United States was focused on irregular warfare in the Middle East, China was watching, China was studying, China was spending. The People's Liberation Army Air Force began a modernization program in the 2000s that has not slowed down for a single day since. They watched how coalition air forces operated in Gulf War I. They studied the suppression of enemy air defenses, they analyzed how stealth aircraft were employed, and they built a response. Not a quick response, not a cheap response, but a systematic, patient, enormously expensive response, designed specifically to counter the advantages that the United States had built and assumed were permanent. By the time the F-22 production line went cold in 2011, China had already begun test flights of the J-20, their own 5th-generation stealth fighter. By the time most Americans had even heard of the J-20, China had over 100 of them in service. Today they have more than 200, with production rates that significantly exceed anything the United States is currently putting into the air. And the J-20 is not a paper airplane. It is a real, capable, sophisticated stealth fighter, designed specifically with the F-22 in mind. So the United States Air Force found itself in a position that its planners had explicitly warned about for 20 years. A peer adversary with advanced stealth aircraft, a fleet size that was growing rapidly, and an American inventory that was capped at 183 jets and could not be increased because the production line no longer existed. But the low numbers problem, as serious as it is only the beginning. Because the second problem is about what the F-22 was actually built to do versus what the future fight actually requires. The F-22 is an air superiority fighter, period. That is what it does. It kills other aircraft. It clears the sky. It was never designed to carry large strike packages, never designed to operate as a node in a networked kill chain, the way modern warfare increasingly demands, and never designed with the kind of open architecture software that would allow it to be rapidly updated as threats evolved. This last point is perhaps the most damaging. The F-22's avionics architecture was designed in the 1990s. The hardware is fast for its era, but it is not fast by modern standards, and critically, it was not designed to be upgraded easily. The aircraft runs on what engineers describe as a legacy architecture, which means that updating its software is not like updating an app on your phone. It is like trying to rebuild a house while you are living in it, in the dark, with tools designed for a different house. Every major software upgrade to the F-22 has been extraordinarily expensive, extraordinarily time-consuming, and extraordinarily painful. As a result, the F-22 today does not have certain capabilities that its pilots need and that its potential adversaries are developing counters to. Its ability to share data with other platforms in real time, what the military calls Link 16 data link capability, has been limited. Other aircraft in a strike package cannot easily share targeting data with the F-22 and vice versa, which means the most capable fighter in the American inventory is partially isolated from the broader networked picture of the battle space. The Air Force has spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to address this, and progress has been made, but the fundamental architectural limitations of the aircraft impose a ceiling that cannot be engineered away, no matter how much money is thrown at it. The third problem is sustainment, and this one is where the money really bleeds. The F-22 has one of the highest cost per flight hour rates of any aircraft in the U.S. military inventory. Depending on the year and the accounting methodology, that number ranges from around $60,000 to over $80,000 per flight hour. For comparison, the F-15C Eagle, which the F-22 was supposed to replace, and which is a 1970s-era design, costs roughly $30,000 per flight hour to operate. The F-22 is roughly 2.5 times more expensive to fly than the aircraft it replaced. And that expense is not static. It grows with age. As the aircraft gets older, the low observable coatings that give it its stealth characteristics require increasingly intensive maintenance. After every flight that exposes the aircraft to rain, humidity, heat, or stress, maintainers must inspect and often repair the surface coatings. This is not a 15-minute job. It involves specialized materials, specialized training, and significant hangar time. An F-22 that is flying regularly can spend more time in maintenance than it spends in the air. At some bases, the ratio of maintenance hours to flight hours has exceeded 20-1. That means for every hour an F-22 is actually airborne, 20 hours of skilled labor are being invested in keeping it capable of flying again. Multiply that across a fleet of 183 aircraft, across dozens of bases, across thousands of maintainers, and the sustainment cost becomes staggering. The Air Force has been spending billions of dollars per year simply keeping the F-22 flyable, before a single weapon is purchased, before a single training sortie is flown, before a single operational deployment is executed. And the jets themselves are aging. The oldest F-22s in the fleet entered service in the mid-2000s. They have accumulated flight hours, stress cycles on their airframes, and environmental exposure that cannot be undone. The Air Force had planned that these aircraft would serve into the 2060s, but achieving that service life requires structural modifications, avionics upgrades, and sustainment investments that, when you actually sit down and calculate the numbers, cost more than the Air Force can justify spending on a platform with the limitations that the F-22 carries. Which brings us to the fourth and final problem, and this one is the one that the Air Force has been most reluctant to say plainly in public, but has been saying clearly in budget documents and congressional testimony for anyone who was paying attention. The F-22, for all its brilliance, is the wrong airplane for the fight that is coming. Not because it lacks capability. In a one-on-one engagement between an F-22 and virtually any other aircraft on the planet, the Raptor wins. Not because it is not lethal. It absolutely is. But because the fight of the 2030s and 2040s is not going to be decided by individual aircraft engaging in single combat over contested airspace. It is going to be decided by networks, by systems that share information across vast distances in milliseconds, by kill chains that begin with a satellite sensor and end with a weapon launched by an aircraft or a drone or a ship or a ground battery that never even sees the target directly. By the ability to overwhelm an adversary's command and control, their sensor networks, their integrated air defenses, not with one perfect aircraft, but with a coordinated swarm of complementary capabilities working together faster than any human decision cycle can counter. The F-22 was built for a different kind of war. A war of individual excellence, of the perfect pilot and the perfect machine outflying and outthinking an enemy in a turning fight at the edge of the envelope. That kind of war still matters. Aerial combat will never be entirely reduced to data networks and algorithm-driven kill chains, but it is no longer the whole picture. And an aircraft that costs $80,000 per flight hour to operate, that cannot easily share data with its teammates, that requires 20 hours of maintenance for every hour of flight, that exists in numbers too small to absorb attrition in a large-scale peer conflict, That aircraft is increasingly a liability, masquerading as an asset. The Air Force has been grappling with this reality for years, and the decision they have arrived at, officially and publicly, is to retire the oldest and least capable F-22s early, reduce the overall fleet size, and concentrate the remaining investment on what comes next. So what does come next? The answer is the program officially designated as Next Generation Air Dominance. Most people inside the defense community call it NAD, and it is the most ambitious fighter aircraft program in American history, possibly in the history of aviation. NAD is not just a new airplane, it is a new concept of operations, a new philosophy of air power, and a new approach to how the United States intends to maintain dominance in contested airspace against peer adversaries for the next 50 years. Let's start with what we actually know, because the program is classified to a degree that makes the F-22's development look transparent. What has been confirmed publicly comes from congressional testimony, budget documents, and statements from senior Air Force officials. And even that limited picture is extraordinary. The NAD aircraft, the crewed platform at the center of the program, has already flown. In September of 2020, Will Roper, who was then the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, made an announcement that stunned the defense world. He confirmed publicly that a full-scale flight demonstrator for NGAD had already been built, had already flown, and had broken multiple records in the process. He did not say which records. He did not show photographs. He did not release video. He simply confirmed that the aircraft existed, that it flew, and that it represented a generational advance over anything currently in the inventory. The fact that a full-scale stealth fighter demonstrator was built and flown without a single photograph leaking to the public is itself remarkable. The security around the program is extraordinary. What we know about the aircraft's characteristics comes from inference, from what senior Air Force officials have said about requirements, and from what the Defense Industrial Base has publicly disclosed about the technology they are developing. What the Air Force has said publicly about NGAD requirements tells a significant story. The platform is expected to operate in what military planners call highly contested environments, which is the clinical language for airspace defended by the most sophisticated integrated air defense systems on the planet. This means the aircraft must be more survivable than the F-22, not just incrementally more survivable, but fundamentally more survivable, against threats that include advanced long-range surface-to-air missile systems like the Russian S-400 and its successors, Chinese HQ-9 variants, and the next generation of integrated air defense systems that both Russia and China are currently fielding. Achieving that survivability requires stealth characteristics that go beyond what the F-22 demonstrated, and they may include capabilities that do not appear on any publicly released specification sheet. There have been references in the defense community to the possibility of active cancellation systems that could supplement passive shaping-based stealth, though the details of any such technology remain classified. The aircraft is expected to be capable of operating as a node in a distributed kill web, which is the current Air Force concept for how air combat will work in the 2030s. Rather than a single aircraft finding, fixing, tracking, and killing a target through its own sensors and weapons, the kill web envisions a network of platforms, some crewed, many uncrewed, working together, with each node contributing part of the sensing, part of the targeting, part of the engagement, and none of them individually exposed to more risk than the mission requires. The NAD crewed aircraft sits at the center of that web, as the quarterback, the decision-maker, the platform that takes the most demanding missions and coordinates the others. Which brings us to the most revolutionary aspect of NAD that has been confirmed publicly. The crewed aircraft does not fly alone. It flies with collaborative combat aircraft, which the Air Force calls CCAs. The CCA program is arguably as important as NGAD itself, possibly more so, because it represents a fundamental transformation in how the Air Force thinks about air power. Collaborative combat aircraft are autonomous or semi-autonomous uncrewed aircraft designed to operate in coordination with crewed platforms like the NGAD or even the F-35. They are not drones in the conventional sense. They are not slow, propeller-driven surveillance platforms orbiting at altitude. They are high-performance jet aircraft, capable of supersonic flight, designed to enter contested airspace alongside their crewed teammates, and perform missions that current doctrine assigns to human pilots. Think about what that means in practice. Today, when an F-22 pilot enters contested airspace, they carry a limited number of weapons internally. The moment those weapons are expended, the aircraft must disengage, return to a tanker, return to base, reload, and come back. That cycle takes time. Time is tactical disadvantage. But if that F-22 pilot is flying alongside 4 or 6 or 8 CCAs, each carrying its own weapons load, each operating as an extension of the pilot's tactical intent, then the effective magazine depth of that tactical formation increases by an order of magnitude. The pilot does not have to withdraw when their own weapons are gone. They can direct a CCA to execute the engagement while they maintain position and situational awareness. But the CCAs are not just flying ammunition dumps. They are sensor nodes, they are communications relays, they are electronic warfare platforms, they are decoys. They can be sent into the highest threat corridors first, to expose enemy radar systems and surface-to-air missile batteries without risking a human life. They can fly ahead of the crewed aircraft and build a real-time picture of the threat environment that the pilot uses to make decisions from a position of knowledge rather than assumption. They can jam enemy communications, suppress enemy radar, and provide targeting data to long-range weapons launched from standoff distances. 2 main CCA designs are currently in development and have been publicly acknowledged. General Atomics is developing what is known as the YFQ-42A, and Anduril Industries, working with General Atomics, is developing the YFQ-44A. These are both described as attritable platforms, which is military language for aircraft that are capable enough to be used in combat, but affordable enough that losing some in a high-intensity conflict is an acceptable operational cost. They are not cheap. They are not expendable in the way that a single-use cruise missile is expendable. But they do not carry the price tag of an F-22 or even an F-35, which means they can be produced in numbers large enough to actually matter in a large-scale fight. The Air Force has talked publicly about wanting hundreds of CCAs, potentially more than 1,000 over the long term. When you pair a force of 100 or more NAD crewed aircraft with hundreds of CCAs operating as their partners, you begin to see the outline of an Air Force that operates in a fundamentally different way than anything that has come before. And here is where the math starts to work in America's favor, in a way that the F-22 alone never could. China has 200-plus J-20s and is building more. If the United States responds by trying to outproduce China in crewed fifth-generation fighters, it loses that competition. China's defense industrial base, its manufacturing capacity, and its willingness to accept lower unit costs through simplified designs give it advantages in a straight aircraft-for-aircraft numbers competition. But if the United States competes by putting smaller numbers of extraordinarily capable crewed aircraft alongside large numbers of sophisticated autonomous wingmen, the equation changes. You are no longer comparing fighter to fighter, you are comparing system to system, and the United States, with its advantages in software, autonomous systems, artificial intelligence, and sensor fusion, believes it can win that competition. Whether that belief is correct will depend on execution. And execution, as the history of major defense programs makes brutally clear, is never guaranteed. Now, let us talk about the cost. Because no discussion of INGAD is complete without confronting the number that has caused the most alarm in the defense community and on Capitol Hill. In early reporting, estimates for the unit cost of a single INGAD aircraft have ranged from around $200 million to over $300 million per aircraft. Some reporting has placed it even higher. For context, an F-22 cost roughly $150 million per aircraft in then-year dollars when the program ended. An F-35A, the conventional takeoff and landing variant that is the most common, currently costs around $80 million per aircraft after years of production learning curve cost reduction. An INGAD aircraft at $300 million per copy would be the most expensive fighter jet in human history by a significant margin. When those numbers entered public circulation in 2023, they created a genuine crisis for the program. Members of Congress, defense analysts, and budget watchdogs asked a reasonable question. If the Air Force could barely afford 183 F-22s at $150 million each, how could it afford enough NGADs at $300 million each to actually matter in a large-scale conflict? A force of 100 NGADs aircraft at that price point would cost $30 billion before spare parts, support infrastructure, training, or weapons. That is more than the entire annual budget of many countries. The Air Force's response to this concern has been, essentially, that the cost is what it is because the threat demands it, that the CCAs reduce the total cost of the system, and that the unit cost will come down with production. But there is a deeper tension embedded in this debate that does not resolve easily. A very small fleet of extraordinarily expensive aircraft is inherently fragile in a way that a larger fleet of somewhat less capable aircraft is not. In a sustained high-intensity conflict against a peer adversary, aircraft will be lost. Pilots will be killed, bases will be struck. If the United States loses 20 NGAD aircraft in the first 2 weeks of a conflict, and it has only 100 total, that is 20% of the entire air dominance fleet gone before the campaign has even reached its most critical phase. There is no production surge that replaces those losses quickly. There is no strategic reserve to draw from. The math is uncomfortable. This is why the relationship between NGAD and the CCA program is so important. The CCAs are meant to absorb attrition. They are meant to be the aircraft that fly the missions with the highest loss probability, while the crewed NAD aircraft are preserved for the missions that require human judgment, human adaptability, and the kind of decision-making that autonomous systems cannot yet reliably provide. Whether that division of risk actually works in practice, under the chaos and friction of real combat, is a question that will only be answered if and when the system is actually used. Let us also talk about the timeline, because the gap between the F-22's retirement and the NGAD's fielding is a real and significant concern. The Air Force has been discussing retiring the oldest and least capable F-22s, roughly 32 aircraft that have been operating in a dedicated test and training role and have not received all the upgrades of the combat-coded fleet, beginning in the mid-2020s. The rationale is that the cost of upgrading these jets to full combat capability exceeds the operational value they would provide, and that the money saved can be redirected toward NGAD and CCA development. This decision has been controversial. Critics point out that even a substandard F-22 is still one of the most capable air superiority fighters on the planet, and that reducing the total inventory at a time when China and Russia are expanding theirs creates a window of vulnerability that is strategically dangerous. The Air Force counters that funding the F-22 sustainment sunk cost while cutting NAD development creates a longer and more dangerous vulnerability window in the future. Neither argument is entirely wrong. Both reflect genuine and irresolvable tension between present readiness and future capability. The NAD aircraft, based on current program timelines, is expected to reach initial operational capability sometime in the early 2030s. That is optimistic by historical standards. Major defense programs almost always take longer and cost more than their initial projections suggest. If NGAD slips to the mid-2030s, and if F-22 retirements continue on their current schedule, there is a period of several years where the United States Air Force will be operating a reduced F-22 fleet that is aging, expensive to sustain, and increasingly challenged by the threats it was designed to face, without the replacement yet available in meaningful numbers. That gap is real. The Air Force knows it. Congress knows it, and the adversaries who study American military capability certainly know it. To bridge that gap, the Air Force has made certain investments in extending and upgrading the F-22 fleet that will remain after early retirements. The Increment 3.2B upgrade package, which has been progressively delivered to the fleet, includes improvements to the electronic warfare suite, the radar, the weapons integration capability, and the data link architecture. A further upgrade package focused on open systems avionics is intended to make the aircraft more adaptable to future software improvements. These are not trivial investments. They represent a recognition that the F-22 will need to remain credible in the threat environment of the late 2020s, even as its replacement is being fielded. But there is a hard ceiling on what upgrades can accomplish. You cannot retrofit the F-22 with an entirely new avionics architecture without essentially rebuilding the aircraft from scratch. You cannot change its physical dimensions, its engine performance envelope, or its fundamental design characteristics. You can make it better. You cannot make it new. One thing that gets overlooked in most discussions of the F-22's future is the extraordinary human capital that is tied to the aircraft. The pilots who fly the Raptor are among the most experienced and capable air superiority pilots in the world. They have spent years mastering a machine that demands more cognitive engagement than virtually any other fighter aircraft ever built. They understand stealth employment, sensor fusion, energy management, and advanced tactics in ways that cannot be written into a manual and handed to a newcomer. As the fleet shrinks, maintaining sufficient flying hours to keep those pilots proficient becomes harder. The aircraft availability issues, driven by maintenance demands, mean that getting the necessary sorties to stay sharp is a constant struggle. And when pilots leave the Air Force for commercial aviation, as many are doing in numbers that the service is struggling to manage, they take that irreplaceable knowledge with them. The pilot shortage that the Air Force is currently experiencing is not just an operational problem, it is a strategic problem. The F-22 fleet is only as capable as the humans who fly it. If the aircraft are available but the pilots who know how to extract their full potential are not, the tactical advantage shrinks. This is another argument for the CCA approach, because autonomous systems do not burn out, do not leave for airline jobs, and do not require years of investment before they can execute their designed missions. But autonomous systems also cannot yet replace the judgment of an experienced pilot in genuinely novel situations, which is why the crewed-uncrewed team concept is positioned as a partnership rather than a replacement. It is also worth stepping back and addressing a question that some people ask about this entire discussion. Does air dominance still matter? In an era of long-range precision missiles, hypersonic weapons, and cyber warfare, is the idea of a fighter jet achieving control of the sky still the decisive factor it was in the 20th century? The answer is unambiguously yes. And the reason is not nostalgia for the dogfighting era. It is operational logic. Control of the air, what military doctrine calls air superiority or air supremacy, depending on the degree of control achieved, is the prerequisite for virtually every other military operation. Ground forces operating without air cover are catastrophically vulnerable to enemy air power, enemy drones, and enemy air-delivered precision weapons. Naval surface groups operating without air cover face overwhelming threats from anti-ship missiles that can be countered most effectively by fighters intercepting the launch platforms before they fire. Supply lines, logistics nodes, command centers, and communications infrastructure are all at risk from an adversary whose air forces can operate without interference. The moment you lose control of the air, you lose the ability to conduct any operation confidently, and you begin a cascading degradation of capability that is extremely difficult to recover from. Ukraine has provided a brutal real-time demonstration of what contested or denied airspace looks like. Neither Russia nor Ukraine has achieved air superiority over the other. The result is that both sides are reluctant to fly crewed aircraft in meaningful numbers over the most contested areas, because the surface-to-air missile threat is too severe. Both sides have lost aircraft in numbers that would be unsustainable in a short, high-intensity conflict. The ability of drones to operate in that environment has been significant, but drones have not replaced air power. They have demonstrated the importance of air power by showing what happens in its absence. If one side had achieved air superiority over Ukraine, the conflict would look fundamentally different. The side with air superiority would be able to strike ground forces, logistics, and command nodes at will. The side without it would be fighting with one arm tied behind its back. Against China in a potential conflict over Taiwan, or in the Pacific more broadly, achieving and maintaining air superiority would be extraordinarily difficult. China has invested enormously in integrated air defense systems, in anti-aircraft missiles, in surface-to-air missile batteries, in active electronically scanned array radars, and in airborne early warning aircraft that could detect and track non-stealthy platforms at great range. The only American aircraft that can operate inside that threat envelope with any reasonable chance of survivability are stealth platforms. The F-22 is one, the F-35 is another. The B-21 Raider bomber, which is currently in the early stages of its operational introduction, is a third. NGAD will be a fourth. But the F-35, despite its stealth characteristics, was not designed for the air superiority mission the way the F-22 was. It was designed as a multi-role aircraft with emphasis on strike. It carries a smaller radar, has less raw maneuverability, and lacks the supercruise capability of the Raptor. Against a J-20 in a close-range engagement, the F-35 is not the platform the Air Force wants leading the fight. This is why the retirement of the F-22 at a pace faster than its replacement arrives matters so much. The window where the United States has a dedicated, purpose-built air superiority stealth platform in sufficient numbers to actually influence a major conflict is narrowing. The F-22 fleet is not growing, it is shrinking. The NAD is not yet here, the CCAs are not yet operational, and the adversaries are not standing still. There is also a geographic reality to the F-22's limitations that rarely gets discussed in mainstream coverage. The aircraft has a combat radius of roughly 500 miles without refueling. In the Pacific theater, where potential conflicts with China would be decided, 500 miles is not far enough to reach most of the airspace where fighting would actually occur, without aerial refueling support. Tanker aircraft, the KC-135s and KC-46s that extend the range of American fighters, are themselves vulnerable. They are large, slow, non-stealthy aircraft that cannot operate inside a contested threat environment. They must stay well back from the actual fight. This creates a geometric problem. The F-22, operating at the edge of its fuel range to reach the fight, arrives with reduced reserves and must begin its return journey sooner than optimal. Tankers that are positioned too far forward to be survivable create a gap that tactical creativity cannot entirely bridge. The NGAD aircraft is expected to have significantly greater range and fuel capacity than the F-22, in part because of its larger physical size, which senior officials have referenced without specifying exact dimensions. Greater range reduces dependence on vulnerable tanker support and extends the area within which the aircraft can operate effectively. Combined with CCAs that can also extend the reach of the overall system, the NGAD formation should be able to cover more airspace, operate further from vulnerable support assets, and sustain presence in contested areas longer than the F-22 could manage. One of the most fascinating aspects of the NGAD program is how it has been developed. The traditional defense acquisition process in the United States is notoriously slow and expensive. Programs take decades from concept to operational capability. The F-22 program began in earnest in the mid-1980s and did not reach initial operational capability until 2005, 20 years from concept to service entry. The assumption had been that all major defense programs work that way, that the complexity of modern aerospace systems simply requires that kind of timeline. NGAD has challenged that assumption. The flight demonstrator that Will Roper referenced in 2020 was developed through a process called digital engineering, in which every aspect of the aircraft design was built, tested, and refined in virtual environments before physical hardware was constructed. Rather than building mock-ups, testing them in wind tunnels, finding problems, redesigning, building new mock-ups, and repeating the cycle over years and years, the digital engineering approach allows designers to run thousands of simulated tests in software, identify and fix problems before a single piece of metal is cut, and arrive at a design that has already been refined through an iteration process that would have taken decades using traditional methods. The results have been remarkable. The speed at which the NGAD demonstrator went from design to first flight reportedly surprised even experienced aviation experts within the program. If the digital engineering approach continues to deliver on its early promise during the full-scale development and production phases, NGAD could enter service significantly faster than historical precedent would suggest. But if the complexity of transitioning from a demonstrator to a fully capable production aircraft reveals problems that the digital models did not predict, the timeline could slip in ways that are difficult to recover from quickly. There is also the question of what happens to the industrial base in the meantime. Lockheed Martin is the primary F-22 contractor and is a primary competitor for the NGAD contract, which has not yet been awarded as of this writing. Boeing is also competing. The choice between these contractors will have enormous implications not just for the aircraft that results, but for the long-term health of the aerospace industrial base. The companies that win major programs invest in the workforce, facilities, and supply chains needed to execute them. The companies that lose begin to shrink those capabilities. Given that the United States may need to sustain NGAD production for decades, the health of the industrial base that will build it is not a secondary concern. It is a strategic asset in its own right. One development that has added complexity to an already complex picture is a decision that the Air Force made in mid-2024 that stunned many observers. The service announced that it was pausing the NGAD program to conduct a review of the program's cost, requirements, and overall structure. This was not a cancellation. It was explicitly described as a review, but the very fact that a review was deemed necessary at this stage raised questions about whether the program's cost had grown to the point where it was straining the overall Air Force budget to a degree that was affecting other priorities. The NAD unit cost estimates that had leaked into public reporting were high enough that completing even a modest-sized fleet at that price would consume an enormous fraction of the Air Force's procurement budget for years. If NAD costs $300 million per aircraft, and the Air Force wants 200 of them, the procurement cost alone is $60 billion before sustainment, weapons, training, or the CCAs that make the system work. The program review appeared designed to determine whether the requirements driving that cost could be adjusted without fundamentally compromising capability, or whether alternative approaches might achieve similar effects at lower cost. The outcome of that review and what it means for the program's timeline and ultimate shape will define American air power for the next generation. If the review results in a more achievable program that enters service on schedule, it will be remembered as a prudent management decision. If it results in delays that open wider gaps in the F-22 to knotted transition, or in a capability that is compromised in ways that adversaries can exploit, it will be remembered differently. This brings us to a broader truth about the challenge facing the United States Air Force right now. The service is trying to do something that has never been done before on this timeline against adversaries of this capability. It is trying to retire one generation of the world's most capable air superiority aircraft, while simultaneously developing and fielding a replacement that must leap ahead of adversaries who are not standing still. And doing it at a time when the defense budget faces genuine pressure from every direction, when the industrial base is stretched, when pilot recruiting and retention is difficult, and when the technology itself, particularly the autonomous systems and artificial intelligence components that make NGAD and CCA concepts work, is advancing faster than any acquisition program can track. The people trying to manage this transition are not making easy choices between good options and bad options. They are making hard choices between painful options and disastrous ones. Every dollar spent on F-22 sustainment is a dollar not spent on NGAD development. Every early F-22 retirement saves money that can accelerate NGAD and CCA, but reduces near-term combat capability. Every requirement added to NGAD makes it more capable and more expensive, and pushes the service entry date further right. Every requirement reduced makes it more affordable and timelier, but potentially less effective against the threat it needs to defeat. The men and women working inside these programs understand the weight of what they are doing. A wrong decision made today in a Pentagon office, in a congressional budget markup, in a design review meeting at Lockheed or Boeing, could result in American pilots flying into a fight in the 2040s with tools that are not adequate to the threat they face. That is not an abstract risk. That is the kind of failure that ends in American aircraft shot down, American pilots killed, and American strategic objectives denied. At the same time, the history of American